climate change denial this time. Been in the news over the last couple of months with the summer that has been experienced in the UK and in other parts of the world, in Europe, throughout Europe, with record temperatures hit over 40 degrees in the UK at one point, with fires blazing throughout Europe. The climate change deniers were out in force. One argument you will often hear from such people is that, well, there's been heat waves before 1976 in the UK, and the usual angle on that is that we just enjoyed the warm weather before. There was never anything bad that happened. There was no panic, there was no nothing. It was just a bit of warm weather which we enjoyed by going down to the beach. Here's an example. This guy, Simon Webb. You might meet Simon Webb again. Let's just say for now he is the master at misrepresenting facts. Here's what he had to say.
Of course, we're being assured that hot days like yesterday's are a product of climate change and that temperatures have been rising in recent decades. Let's just think about that claim for a minute. The temperature yesterday rose to 38.1 centigrade, which is a little over 100 Fahrenheit. This precipitated the declaration of a national emergency and dire warnings of how many people were likely to die. There was a ferocious heat wave in 1911, of course, 3 years before the start of the First World War. In the description to this video, I give a link to the Wikipedia page about this event. That year, the temperature in England reached 36.7 centigrade, which is over 98 Fahrenheit. It was to be 80 years before that record was broken. The records for the number of hours of sunshine each day that year have never been broken. Trains ran as normal. The thumbnail to this video shows girls paddling in the Serpentine in Hyde Park. The hot weather was a cause for enjoying oneself in those days.
Yeah, so he's talking there about a heat wave in 1911, where there was indeed a long heat wave which affected the UK. And of course, he focuses on that it was not a problem, that people went to the paddling pool and enjoyed the paddling pool. One thing I will say for Simon Webb, in his defence, he does give his sources, so you can always check up on what he says, so that's a good thing. However, I can only assume that he kind of makes the assumption that no one's going to bother to check up, because when you do check up on his sources, you actually find that the source says completely the opposite of what he states. So let's look at the Wikipedia page which he himself used, and we find that actually during 1911 there were countrywide strikes. Why were there strikes? Well, because people did not want to risk their lives working in unbearably hot conditions. So there were strikes. Not only that, in Lancashire they completely changed the working day. Okay, so the working day in Lancashire started at 4:30 AM and finished at noon, so that workers could avoid the searing heat of the afternoon. The Times newspaper ran a death toll which is titled Death by Heat. It was a death by heat column which they gave the names of the people who died in the heat. So it was not all paddling in a paddle pool. there were drastic consequences, and it was a real problem for people in 1911. There was, of course, a drought. But all of that, Simon Webb will happily ignore in order to push through his kind of climate change denial agenda. And then it comes, of course, to the fires in London, because there were a bunch of fires in London at some point. There were 2,600 calls, if I'm right, of fires. That's not 2,600 fires, that's 2,600 calls about fires. 500 is considered a particularly busy day. There were 2,600 on that day. Here's what he had to say.
In other countries, grass fires of this kind are often caused deliberately, and yet in this case the only suspect seems to be climate change. If it was a series of coordinated arson attacks, who might have been responsible? Well, bored school children and teenagers whose schools had been closed and who were consequently at a loose end would be one possibility. Another, and to me much more likely, would be a coordinated campaign by people like Extinction Rebellion, who, as we know, will stop at nothing.
Yeah. So, of course, he's very reasonably suggesting that it must be down to arson. And he doesn't reference actually, but he claims that the fires which happen abroad outside of the UK is usually down to arson. Well, when you check this up and you go to, say, the California Fire Service, you find that arson counts for between 7 to 10% of the wildfires that take place in California. You find the same thing, by the way, in Australia as well. That arson generally counts for about, of these big wildfires that take place, between 7 and 10% are down to arson. Now, human activity, of course, is much higher. I think it's about 75% of fires are caused by human activity. But 7 to 10% is down to arson. You might say, or Simon Webb might say, you see, it's human activity that causes fires, not climate change. And of course, this is the straw man which Simon Webb subtly uses in his arguments here. That, of course, it's not climate change that causes fires, it's arson, it's human activity. And that everyone claims that climate change causes fires. Well, that isn't actually the claim, though, is it, Simon? We all know that fires have a cause. Quite often, by the way, it's barbecues, which is why barbecues get banned here in Sweden in the summer quite often when it gets so dry, so as not to cause forest fires here in Sweden. But climate change sets the conditions which make fires much more likely. That's all that the claim is, and it's blooming obvious. I think most of us, I don't even know why I'm making this video, because it's kind of self-evident to most people that when you have periods of long, hot, dry weather without any rain and the grass is very brown like a tinderbox, then there is a much, much greater risk of fire, and that those fires can happen very, very easily. If someone's smoking a cigarette under kind of normal British conditions, let's say, and you flick your cigarette on the ground, nothing happens. You do that in the middle of a heat wave, it causes a big fire which can cause catastrophe. And climate change, those conditions are happening more and more. It's obvious. If you want a picture of this, we can go back to comparing heat waves. And it is kind of interesting when we look at the heat wave of 1976 and we look at the global temperatures around that heat wave, this is what it looks like. And when we compare to 2022, this is what the heat wave looked like. I think the difference in those two pictures is rather self-explanatory. So, yeah, it might just have been a spell of warm weather in 1976 or 1911, but climate change definitely has some effect now. Thank you very much for watching Jason Talks on YouTube. Please remember you can support me through joining in with the discussion below. Please subscribe, and also if you're feeling particularly generous you can support me through Patreon. See you again.